I'm here on behalf of the 1,000-odd missionary colleagues, the board, the voluntary leaders, and members of small and big prayer groups of one of the largest indigenous mission agencies called FMPB, or Friends Missionary Prayer Band. As one of the founding leaders and its president for more than 3 decades, Dr. Samuel T. Kamalasan is widely known, respected, and loved by people with a passion for missions. He would always warn its leadership that the movement should not degenerate into becoming an institution, into a bureaucracy, and finally into being a monument. Even in the early years of indigenous missions movement, when I say the early years, I'm talking about the 50s, late 50s, and the 60s of last century. Dr. Samuel T. Kamalasan believed that mission was holistic, an initiative that was made in the beginning of the 20th century by Bishop Azariah, the first Indian bishop in the beginning of the 20th century, resulted in the formation of 2 mission agencies, the Indian Missionary Society and the National Missionary Society, fully indigenous. And then there was a gap of almost 5 decades, after which this movement and a few other movements like the Indian Evangelical Mission were formed by leaders of whom Dr. Samuel T. Kamalasan was a key person in this. So he firmly believed that spiritual transformation led to social transformation, economic transformation, educational transformation. So the gospel impinged on every aspect of a person's life. As a result of this very strong conviction that he had, Dr. Kamalasan was not just a visionary, but a missionary in every true sense of the term. So he translated this conviction of his, that missions is holistic. Out of that was born the Bethel Agriculture Fellowship, to cater to people with all these needs. He co-founded it with Mr. P. Samuel, who is widely known as P. Sam Anachi, meaning the older brother. Maybe not to him, but to people like us who related with him. And as a member of Bethel Agriculture Fellowship Board, I also stand before you representing them, the thousands of children, many of them orphans, and deprived farmers, and economically deprived people who were blessed by the ministry of Bethel Agricultural Fellowship. Dr. Samuel T. Kamalesan, we would call him Kamalesan Annan, like it is a practice in India to call among mission circles anyone older than you as Annan, irrespective of how great that age difference was. So we always called people brother. And he was not someone sitting on the presidential high chair. He was the president of FMPB's board and the Bethel Agriculture Fellowship Board until about a year and a half ago, when he decided to step down because of health reasons. He always connected with the grassroots, the missionaries working in remote areas. He made it a point, especially in his earlier years, younger years, to travel to those mission fields, stay with them, interact and connect with them. Once he was preaching a Christmas message, and when it came to Joseph and Mary being accommodated in a manger at the inn, he mentioned that it needs a lot of contextualizing for the Western minds. How could anyone go and stay there in a manger? But he said, I realized when I preach the gospel in India, I don't need to contextualize the situation, because that is a situation which is a reality for many people. So he and the missionary in that particular mission field in the state of Gujarat, which he was visiting, were made to stay in the house of one of the new Christian believers. And he said the whole night, the only thing that separated us and the buffaloes in the house was a bamboo mat. And they could hear the buffaloes making all sorts of noise. So the whole night, I guess he couldn't sleep well. But he said that opened the eyes, my eyes, to the fact that the gospel is more easily preached in the Asian context and Middle Eastern context, because it is a reflection of what you see even now. So he was one who connected regularly with not just those in authority, not just the board, but with every humble missionary whenever it was possible for him to do that. As we all know, he was an evangelist, an expositor of God's word. I still remember his exposition of the second chapter of Ephesians and the first 10 words. So when he preached, he wanted his preaching to be a dialogue. He would often appeal to people to respond to what he said. He would ask people to answer his questions. And sometimes he would be so frustrated that he said, it looks like I'm speaking to the chairs in this hall. And he would even get down and walk down the aisle asking people to respond to his message. And also he would want them to write down points that were of significance so that they could go back and meditate on those at a more leisurely pace. Because we think there is a hearing of the message and an application of that message in our lives. But he believed there was hearing of the message and recalling in a in our private meditation to see how God would reveal himself in other ways and give other insights so that it could take on a richer personal meaning in our personal lives. Once I had the privilege in 2005 of translating for him when he was addressing our missionaries in one of their conferences they have once every 5 years, when all these 1,000-odd missionaries come to one place for 3 or 4 days of retreat. So I had to translate his English into Hindi, the national language of India. And I was a bit relieved because when you translate for him in Tamil, which was his mother tongue, and my mother tongue, he would always be checking the accuracy of the translation. So I was relieved that I was translating in a language he didn't know. But then he called me before his preaching, called me to his room, and I think he had one of those notebooks that we saw, these old notes. So he explained every part of that message so that I would be prepared with the right vocabulary, the right expressions. And his felicity of expression, both in English and Tamil, was phenomenal. He could, with equal ease, preach in English and also simultaneously translate it into Tamil, his mother tongue. Like people like me who have lived in India, in Tamil Nadu, sometimes we look enviously at him of his language proficiency in Tamil in spite of having lived out of the country for many years. He would also always say, once or twice he told me that at the immigrations, the officials would ask, why is that you don't take an American citizenship? Because he had permanent residency permit, and he could have easily taken up an American citizenship. So he said, my ministry requires that I be an Indian citizen, which gives me access to go anywhere in India to preach and to other countries as well. He had a weakness that I also share, the weakness of at least talking about the place where he grew up, namely Trichy. When he would speak of football, that is I guess it is the American soccer, he would talk of how he grew up in Trichy, and as students of a group of students, these matches would happen in the playground of Bishop Heber High School. So they would climb up on trees to have a vantage view of the match if they couldn't go into the stadium. So these were not very high-rise, temporary stadium built out of wood and then dismantled. So he would talk of that. And I too come from the same city where he grew up. And I too still have a weakness for that city. I try to read the news pertaining to that. And once in one of our private conversations, especially in the past 5 years that I've been in this role as General Secretary, I had many occasions whenever he visited India to work on his itinerary, his programs. So we would also discuss his Trichy experiences. So I don't need to talk about his other interests, his other qualities that others have already talked about. And only want to say on behalf of thousands of his admirers back home in India, not just limited to the state of Tamil Nadu that he belonged to, but across the the other states and other cultures and other language groups in India, he was always remembered, he was spoken highly about. Because for us, every state is a country, almost a country in terms of its population, in terms of its linguistic diversity. And people generally, it's not easy for people of another state to accept, respond to an evangelist or preacher from another state, because language parochialism is widely seen in India, and it's easier for them to identify with people who speak their own language. But when it came to Dr. Kamalesan, across these language barriers, he endeared himself to Christians, non-Christians, wherever they were. So whenever I travel to other states and people say, introduce me, they immediately ask about Dr. Samuel T. Kamalesan. So in a way, he was the face of missions, the face of Friends Missionary Prayer Band, and the face of Bethel Agriculture Fellowship, wherever we talk of these institutions. Now our board has a different president, but when we go back, people think that Dr. Samuel T. Kamalesan is still the president of this missionary movement. So I would like to conclude assuring the bereaved family members and friends that our prayers would always be with them, and we would also continue the legacy left behind by this great man, Dr. Samuel T. Kamalesan. Thank you.